people don't stop shooting whitetails. It's a funny thing. They can shoot 10, 20, 30 whitetails in their life and be perfectly happy. And so we consistently had to make these deer bigger, prettier, nicer deer. Good morning, Travis. We're at Global Hunting Solutions. Hope you guys are having a good weekend. Podcast number 3 coming up. Actually, number 4 coming up. So what we're going to talk about today is whitetail deer in Texas. I know I've got some older videos we did 5 or 6 years ago about how the whitetail situation in Texas was going, but I wanted to update you guys and give you an idea of where we're at today. So the whitetail in Texas. So when I started hunting in the early 90s, it was basically mostly free range hunting, meaning low fence, free range type hunts. And so as the whitetails progressed and the clients became more selective on their deer and the need for bigger deer, we started putting up a lot of high fences here in Texas. We put up 8-foot fences where we could control the populations of the deer coming in and going out of the ranches. Once you start this process of high fencing a ranch, it's a lot of work, and it's up to you to make it a good thing because now you're in control of everything. And so they can no longer diversify and move across the land freely as the feed availability lessens. So we started putting up high fences and figuring out, if we selectively harvest a few what we called management bucks or cull bucks back then, we could manipulate the genetics from a typical whitetail deer wanting to be an 8-point, 4 on each side. That's what we call it in Texas, to, straight up 10s and 12s and bigger deer. So what we started doing in the early 90s is we started harvesting some of these inferior class genetics out of our ranches in high fences and leaving the best of the best to breed with our good does. And so these high fences not only kept our population pristine and sterile from deer coming into the ranch, it prevented our deer from leaving. So we had to go in and figure out, what will this land accommodate? And so we would get in the helicopter, and I'm telling you, this is in the early 90s. This was early on, and we'd fly, and we would count deer, and we'd say, okay, well, we've got, 1 deer per every 6 acres. And, we believe by looking at the land and doing some forb analysis and overall ranch health, we could say this ranch probably needs to be a deer for every 12 acres. So basically, we need to cut the deer population in half. And then we look at the buck to doe ratio and we see what the ratio is now. And in most cases, in my area, the buck to doe ratio was about 1 to 4 or 1 to 6, meaning 1 male for every 4 to 6 does. And so comfortably, I like to advise people, 1 to 2, 1 to 2.5, one buck for every 2 to 2.5 does. If you get it any tighter than that, and I've done it, just to see what would happen, is these bucks become extremely aggressive on each other for the competition to breed the does. And so therefore, our breeding season starts early November. These deer start fighting the bucks and they start breaking up their antlers. And so, we were going backwards at that point. We had tremendous deer, but we couldn't harvest any of them because half of them were broke. And so we learned, we need to put a few more does out there, make the aggression lessen, or take some of these bucks out that were too aggressive. We had one particular deer that every year this deer would come out of velvet and he would break every single antler on his head, and vice versa. He would break some of the other deer up too. And so the deer was extremely hard to shoot. He was very smart. And he was in a high fence. He was in 1,650 acres. And so we tried to harvest this deer for 2 or 3 years, and he just never would show himself. We saw him on the trail cameras, but he'd always come in at night, and he was just super hard to find. Well, finally, later on in his life, I think he was 6.5 years old when we shot him. We finally got him. He only had 1 broke tine, fortunately, but he was a tremendous deer. He was just very aggressive. So my point is so when we high fence these ranches, now we're in charge. So we do the aerial survey. We figure out what our buck to doe ratio is, what our carrying capacity is. Then we implement a feeding program, meaning we put up some high protein feeders, free choice feeders. The deer can eat whenever they want. come and go as they please at their leisure. And so, depending on the land and the use and the numbers, we would put up X amount of feeders and use X amount of feed per month. And so we want to be available for these deer to eat 5 to 6 pounds a day per deer of feed if that's what they want. So we do that. And, we start controlling these populations in the high fence and outside the high fence too. I've hunted a lot of low fence ranches in South Texas that had tremendous genetics after we started taking care of it. And so you don't have to have a high fence to grow big deer, but it gets you there quicker, So that's what we started doing. The progression of the deer, back in the 90s, we were shooting 150, 160, 170 inch deer. And the hunters were super happy with that. But every year the bar would get raised. We'd get the calls. Hey, I've been to Texas the last 10 years. I've shot a 150. I've shot a 160. I've shot a 170. I want a 180. Well, 180 inch deer back then was super hard to grow just because the genetics hasn't had time to catch up. And so it takes multiple generations to get these deer to what we were looking for. And so now we decided we're going to raise deer in the pens. We could get there faster. We could grow bigger deer with less effort. So many of the ranches applied for these permits. We started with a permit called DMPs. So we would be able to put some does in the pen, catch a buck off of our land with a permit, place this buck in the pen, and breed the does in November, December, January, and then release those deer back on the ranch. So we knew exactly which buck were breeding which does. Now, my opinion is the does are everything in whitetail breeding. I think 70 to 80% of what you see on their head becomes from the doe. So we had no way of controlling or knowing which does were coming out of the pasture. So then we started buying and developing pedigrees, just like the racehorses or the dogs or the registered cattle. These deer were forming generational pedigrees. And then we knew exactly, who their mother was, who their grandmother was, who their great-grandmother was. And we could pair them up with a buck that we felt like that might match up the best. And so, it didn't take but a couple of years, and the industry, not me, but the industry started producing some tremendous bucks. And so then we got into artificially inseminate these does just because some of these bucks passed away, and we would collect the semen, and we would freeze it, and we could breed the does artificially and not only sink their estrus, meaning they would ovulate basically at the same time, and we'd have our babies on a good schedule. And we knew within 2 or 3 weeks most of our babies would be born. It's not 100% on artificial insemination. It highly depends on who collects and who does insemination, and it depends on your deer. And so I've seen anywhere from 50% conception rate all the way up to 99% conception rate. So it varies. It's a very manual intensive operation. And we'll get to that on another video on how all that works. But my main point is just where we are today. And so we started doing this, and we started producing, 150, 160 inch deer at 2 years old. And then some of these deer were 3 at 200, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And therefore, the supply was bigger. The demand didn't go away. We had plenty of hunters. And so some of these breeders were on smaller parcels of land, meaning they did not have a ranch to release these deer out of the pens on. So they would sell the deer. And a lot of these people got word that, the deer were very valuable, and they wanted to get in the business. So these operators on the smaller parcels, I'm going to call them mom and pop operation for lack of a better term. Some of these people take out bank loans, mortgage their houses, mortgage their land, and built these pens, and they were raising deer in the pens, and they had tremendous deer. And their plan was, we'll get our genetics, we'll stack our genetics up, we will be able to sell some of these deer off to other ranches to help their genetics. And so I'll leave that on the table for now. And then, every year the bar would be set a little higher, meaning the hunters would call and say, hey, at first it was 150, then 180 inch deer. I want to shoot a 200 inch deer. Well, 200 inch deer back then we weren't under every rock. I mean, it was hard to grow a 200 inch typical deer. And so, the prices were at the highest they ever were at this time. We were charging a lot of money for these deer because, the supply was pretty low on 200 inch deer, but the demand was really high. because the bar just kept getting higher and higher. And so I did this for years, and the genetics in the pens got better. The genetics on the ranches got better. We were releasing some of these controlled does back into the ranches and enhancing the actual native herd. And so it was a great success. And we were doing really good with it, meaning the industry in a whole, not me. I say we, but it was all of us. We were all doing it together. I had pen raised deer, and I had the ranch, and we had some big deer. And so, fast forward 10, 15 years later, everyone's got big deer because now the genetics have been in place for a long enough time where we have these pedigrees stacked and stacked and stacked for generations and generations. We can predict pretty much what we're going to get. And on the artificial insemination side, the technology was better. People were figuring out how to do it. People were doing embryo transfers. And the industry as a whole were just knocking it out of the park. When we did that for I was in it for 15, 20 years. Every year the agencies made it tougher on us to operate, meaning they were implementing some rules that made it difficult for us to make a profit. The feed prices kept going up, and the deer prices were going down because the supply was so good because we did such a good job breeding the deer, and everyone had big deer. The demand was still roughly the same. People don't stop shooting whitetails. It's a funny thing. They can shoot 10, 20, 30 whitetails in their life and be perfectly happy. And so we consistently had to make these deer bigger, prettier, nicer deer. And so over time, there was, I think there was around 2,000 breeders in Texas at the peak, somewhere right in there. Don't quote me on that, but there was quite a few. And we had some tremendous deer coming out of these guys. And then these guys, that was their passion. I mean, including me. I mean, I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. We thought we were really, helping the population, and the agencies didn't like it. They felt like that us deer breeders were contributing to the bad word CWD, chronic wasting disease. So we got a lot of heat over that, and the regulations started up in the bar on the regulations, and some of the stuff that we were having to do was it was very time consuming. The record keeping was very stringent. Our permitting process was stringent, which that's all fine, but we were all complying with all the rules and regulations, and everybody was going on in business as normal. Well, then the agencies decided that we needed to start testing all these deer for CWD, meaning we had to do certain type of tests with the vet to prove our herd didn't have CWD. Meanwhile, CWD is everywhere. It's in the western states, Utah, Colorado, Nevada. CWD exists in the natural world. We had very few cases that were ever documented in these pen deer, and we weren't testing them. And so time went by, and the regulations outweighed the enjoyment for me, and I can speak for a lot of other ranches that, it just became a hassle. And so a lot of these people elected to shut down their breeding facilities and do something different. With most of us that had ranches where we could release the deer on the ranch, it wasn't a huge ordeal because we could still recap with the improved genetics in the pasture, and we could do some hunting on some of these deer that were ready. And it was a win-win for us and a lot of people. But a lot of these mom and pop operations, they didn't have a ranch to release them on. So inadvertently, they had to sell their deer at a lower price, to remove them for the pens and then comply with all the agency regulations associated with getting these deer out of your pen, which is very, very complicated. I went through the process, and a lot of people I know have. And so, now we lost at least half of the breeders and half of the genetics due to this, which is very unfortunate because we worked many, many years making these pedigrees where they are today. And so I elected, like I say, to close my pens and release my deer and get out of the business. And a lot of people I know have done the same. And a lot of these mom and pop operations, financially, it really impacted them negatively because, they had loans on these deer and deer pens. And just like raising cattle, they had a note that they had to pay. And when they sold their deer, the price was on the downfall. And so, when you get a capital call, you have to come up with it. So a lot of them got in trouble. And so it's very, very, very unfortunate. But, times are looking up. I mean, I think now the people that are in the deer business, and a lot of my good friends are still in the deer business, and they're doing well. And they're going to stick with it. It's just a lot more work for them. Most of these people do it full time. So, they have the time to devote to these regulations and the quality of deer. And hopefully in the future that the agencies can agree on how to do these things and and facilitate these problems that they have in a realistic and friendly way where everybody can do well with it. There's still plenty of big deer out there, plenty of big deer in the pens, plenty of big deer in the pastures, and the genetics, the advancement of the feed is just tremendous these days. These guys are doing a tremendous job formulating these feeds for these whitetail deer. So, I'm seeing a lot of good deer out there still, a lot of good deer in the pen. So, the hunting here in Texas is still very strong. And so, fortunately, the prices are kind of coming up a little bit now that the supply it's flip-flopped. So the supply now is here and the demand is here. And, the bar now is 250, 300-inch deer. That's what we get a lot of calls on these days. And they're still hard to find. A 300-inch whitetail deer is tough. And everybody wants a nice, clean, pretty typical deer. No one wants to shoot one that's just crazy with a lot of junk. So a lot of my friends are shooting towards these typical deer. So like this year in particular, there was a shortage of deer out there. And so we had more deer. And we just got this conversation last night, actually. We have more hunters than we have deer because we no longer have deer in the pen and we can't produce them like we used to. So it takes more time in the pasture. And so we're trying to figure out what we're going to do in the upcoming years to facilitate our hunters that still want to go after these nice deer. But we'll get it figured out and continue on. So that's my spill on whitetail deer in Texas right now. You can expect the prices to be good. They're fair. But these guys that are raising deer, it costs a lot of money to raise these deer, feed these deer, take care of these deer. The feed costs now are tremendous. And so hopefully these guys can recoup some of their investments on these purchases that they've made. If you want to hear more about the whitetail industry, just drop me some comments there and we can talk about that. And I might do a podcast later on pen raised deer and how we got there, some of the genetics and some of the pedigrees and talk particulars about that. But hope you guys have a good week. We got a lot of stuff going on this week. We are headed to Hermosillo, to Mexico. I'm taking a group down there, eight hunters into Mexico. We're going to be hunting big mule deer, desert bighorn, Coues deer, and that'll be it for this week. We're going to shoot a lot of video down in Hermosillo area and have it edited for you guys and make a long production out of it. So that'll be fun. It's a great hunt. If you guys are interested in hunting Hermosillo or anywhere in Mexico for mule deer, let me know. I've got some good places to go, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. So that's where we'll be this week. So maybe I'll shoot some live video while we're there and show you guys the process. And then we'll later on have a podcast about hunting in Mexico, the particulars of getting there, how you get there, logistics of firearms, etc. So you guys have a good week. Thanks for supporting the channel. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.